Today we're talking about the real truth behind why countries are electrifying their cars and looking at alternative energy sources. We'll also see how Texas went from cattle to oil and now to high tech, why the U.S. is conserving its oil rather than selling or consuming it, and how one day you'll pay $60,000 for a new non-luxury economy car because of all this mess. Energy, we all need it, and car factories are no exception. But ever wonder what type of energy car factories use to pump out the millions of new cars worldwide? If you guessed burning fossil fuels like coal, you'd be right. But just how much energy are we talking about here? Well, an automaker with a daily output of 1,000 cars easily uses several 100,000 megawatt hours of electricity per year. That's about as much energy as would be needed to power an entire medium-sized town. Just think, in a car factory, you've got massive pressing instruments to shape sheet metal into body parts. Robots assemble vehicle bodies using thousands of glue dots and welding spots. And then, of course, there's all the conveyors needed to bring the doors, engine, powertrain, and interior fittings to the assembly line for installation. Believe it or not, the paint shops account for 45 to 60% of the factory's energy use. That's because of all the energy needed to keep paint at the right temperature, power its robots, and run large ventilation systems. If you find all this surprising, there's more. Ever wonder how much energy it takes to produce new electric cars? After all, EVs are on the rise and will soon become more widespread and mainstream than traditional combustion engine cars. EV cars are marketed as a cleaner, greener solution to our transportation needs. But here's the thing, ironically enough, it demands more energy to make one EV than to make one traditional combustion engine car. Most EV plants rely on burning fossil fuels to power their plants, but analysts expect nuclear-generated electricity to soon take over. That's because it's the only energy source that delivers reliable, carbon-free energy 24 hours a day. Nuclear energy is produced from uranium, which is a naturally radioactive ore, and uranium has been mined on almost every continent. Guess which country produces the most fossil fuels like coal and will soon be producing nuclear energy? When it comes to coal production, China is at the top. In 2019, China was responsible for almost 47% of the world's entire coal output. That's almost 3.7 billion tons of coal that China extracted that year. Did you know that China is also the world's biggest consumer of coal? That year, they consumed nearly 53% of the world's total consumption. A couple of years ago, President Xi Jinping announced plans to target full carbon neutrality before 2060. That's because in the coming years, China will lose its current top spot in favor of producing more reliable energies instead. Currently here in the U.S., we take the third spot for coal production just after India. In 2019 in the U.S., we produced 640 million tons of coal. Now I know what you're thinking, that's a lot of coal. True, but did you know it was our lowest level of coal since the 1970s? That's all due to competition from cheap natural gas and increasingly low-cost renewables. Because of this, there's less demand for coal from our domestic power sector. Ex-President Trump had promised to revive the coal industry during his election campaign, but today the industry is far from being revived. The decline in coal production is actually expected to accelerate in the coming years. So, what will happen when we eventually go out with the coal and in with nuclear? Do we ever produce enough nuclear power in the U.S. to even stop powering domestic factories with coal and other fossil fuels? Actually, the answer is yes. Believe it or not, the U.S. is the largest nuclear electricity producer in the world. In 2020, we churned out a massive 789,919 gigawatt hours of nuclear energy. With all this nuclear energy being produced here in the U.S., where's most of our electricity coming from? Well, here's the thing. Electricity can be created by renewable versus unrenewable sources. For example, think wind power versus coal. So, how renewable is our energy production? Well, the U.S. is definitely not top of the renewable energy production list, at least not yet. In 2020, most of our electricity was generated by natural gas, nuclear energy, and coal. None of these are renewable sources of energy, although nuclear energy is recyclable. Did you know that in 2020, 35% of all the energy consumed in the U.S. was by petroleum, and 34% was by natural gas? Natural gas production reached a record high of 33.97 trillion cubic feet per day. That's no small amount. It's all because of more efficient drilling and production techniques. The more natural gas that's produced, the lower natural gas is priced, and lower price means more usage by the electric power and industrial sectors. But let's talk about oil consumption in the U.S. Guess where most of it comes from? The answer might surprise you. Canada. Believe it or not, last year a huge 51% of our total petroleum, including crude oil imports, came from Canada. We imported almost 8.5 million barrels of petroleum per day. Most of our oil imports come directly from Canada, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and up until a few months ago, Russia. Did you know that the U.S. is actually one of the largest crude oil producers? We became the world's top crude oil producer in 2018 and maintained a lead position through 2020. U.S. oil refineries obtained crude oil produced right here at home home in other countries. Then we supply our crude oil to the world market. As of last year, we've been producing crude oil in 32 states, and we exported about 8.6 million barrels per day. Hopefully by now you see that something's not adding up. Right now in the U.S., we're conserving most of our oil reserve instead of consuming or selling it. But why? There's actually a name for this. It's called Strategic Petroleum Reserve. These reserves are basically exactly what they sound like. Hundreds of millions of barrels of oil are stored mainly in salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana. The purpose is to prepare for any crisis that raises oil prices. The idea is only to tap these reserves in case of a true crisis like a natural disaster or a war. And it so happens we're in the middle of one oil crisis right now. That's why a couple months ago in March, President Biden announced a huge release of oil from the Strategic Oil Reserve. The goal was to temper gas prices that are currently spiking at a 14-year high. Right now, we have roughly 568 million barrels in reserve. Funny enough, some analysts believe the real benefit of these oil reserves isn't just monetary, it's also psychological. It makes Americans feel like our government is effectively driving down energy costs during the war. Just how much gas are we talking about? A historic 1 million barrels a day for the next 6 months. Actually, did you know that last November, President Biden also released 50 million barrels of oil to try to lower gas prices? But here's the real question. How does conserving all this oil impact gas and electricity prices? On paper, the idea is the more oil is in the market, the lower the price will be. But with us using 20 million barrels of oil a day, 1 million more barrels a day won't really lower prices. Speaking of prices, you should get ready to see a major spike in the price of something extremely important in your life: electricity. The U.S. is advocating EVs more and more, and we're moving away from combustion engine cars. And especially after the 2035 combustion engine ban, we won't have much of a choice when it comes to buying new cars. EVs will be the only option when it comes to new car sales. And this means we'll end up using more and more electricity over time. Oil will no longer be an energy source. Imagine all the charging stations, power grids, and infrastructure that will be needed for all the EVs that get sold. We're talking millions and millions of EVs, all depending on the same thing: electricity. To produce enough electricity to charge all these EVs means one thing: things are going to get a lot more expensive. Now I know what you're thinking. Why not just increase renewable energy sources like wind turbine energy to drive down prices? True, in many places the cost of new renewable electric generation is at or below the sources like natural gas, coal, and nuclear. But get this, a recent study suggests that policies that mandate renewable energies use have actually, ironically enough, driven up the retail price of electricity. Individual power generators rarely operate alone. Each are part of a larger grid-connected system, and that's expensive. Plus, wind turbines can't be placed in the middle of Times Square. They have to be placed in places with ample sun, wind, and land. Since these areas are usually far, far away from population centers, more transmission infrastructure is needed to connect supply and demand, which means more money will be needed. So, no, wind turbines won't be able to solve increasing electricity prices. If you find all this interesting, well, listen to this. Because of all this new attention to the energy sources we use to fuel our lives, some states are completely transforming their industries and economies. Take Texas, for example. If you were in Texas 120 years ago, you'd see that their number one industry was cattle. Why not? They had the perfect environment for it. But in 1901, the Lucas #1 well blew in Spindletop near Beaumont, Texas. The gusher spewed oil more than 100 feet up into the air until it was capped 9 days later. And that was the dramatic debut that quickly pushed Texas' economy from its rural agricultural roots into a petroleum and industrial age. Today, Texas remains the state with the most cattle, but it's also the largest oil-producing state in the nation. It produces 43% of the total U.S. oil production. We're talking almost 1.8 billion barrels each year. It's also the top producer of natural gas domestically. On top of that, of course, right now, high-tech companies have been moving to Texas. I'm talking about Tesla, Oracle, Hewlett-Packard. Dropbox CEO Drew Houston is another new resident in Lone Star State. Must have liked the name, Houston. Texas already has Dell and Texas Instruments headquartered there. Apple will be setting up its second largest campus in Texas. Not many people know this, but the state of Texas is the 9th largest economy in the world and the top exporter of technology, outbeating even California. But now, if we were to open a news website or app right now, chances are you'd see at least one article having to do with climate, more specifically global warming. But have you ever considered some government officials may be using global warming as a red herring? By diverting public attention towards global warming, they get points for championing a good cause for humanity and posterity. But can it be that they're using it to push another agenda? Now hear me out. Right now, oil in large amounts exists in just a few countries. But Western countries, especially the US, Canada, and Europe, don't want to be dependent on other countries for oil. Can this be the reason why Western countries are pushing hard to promote EV technology? But they use climate change and environmental justice as a selling point. Why? Well, let's be honest. What sells better and which one would you support? If government said, we need to move EVs to save the world, or if they said, we need to move to EVs for the sake of national security so that we're not dependent dependent on oil countries, and oh, by the way, this means you'll end up paying higher car prices and electricity costs will go up too. See what I mean? It's not inconceivable now, is it? If the U.S. really cared about the climate and ecology, we'd be seeing more aggressive efforts already in place. But we don't see much in reality. In most U.S. states, you can just walk up to an average grocery store and you can still find plastic bags in unlimited use, and they're free. Only a few states have banned them, and most states freely allow. Similar thing with single-use straws and polystyrene containers. Anyway, under the guise of so-called climate control regulations, soon consumers will need to pay higher purchase prices for new cars because soon sales of new combustion engines will be banned. In other words, in a few years, if you want a new car, your only option will be an EV. And here's the catch. Currently, there's no way to make EVs any cheaper or to significantly improve driving range. You can't simply create large electric SUVs to use some battery that will find an electric sedan. EVs are more expensive than combustion engine cars as it is. With higher prices, it means electric sedans may outsell electric SUVs, and electric sedans will be priced high, similar to a combustion engine crossover. And EV crossovers will be priced like luxury SUVs we see now. If you don't believe me, just save this video and watch it again in 2035 when the combustion engine ban kicks in, and then you'll see if my forecast comes true. But look, this is just speculation, of course. No one really knows how bad the current situation really is, but there's one thing we can certainly agree on. The economy and our way of living won't get back to pre-pandemic levels anytime soon, if at all. But now you tell me, do you agree with these speculations and forecasts? And what are your predictions? Do you think the U.S. should be conserving oil right now or consuming it? Please share your opinion by commenting below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for your support.